The German general leaned forward, eyes narrowed, as the distant rumble echoed across the training ground. He had been told that the Americans were bringing something unusual, some sort of experimental tank that could supposedly climb walls. To him, it sounded ridiculous, an exaggeration from an overexcited engineer or a boastful young officer. Tanks didn't climb walls. They crushed them, maybe, but climb? That was absurd. He lit a cigarette, a thin smile curling under his mustache, and muttered, "Show me this circus trick." The dust cloud grew on the horizon. Through binoculars, the shape emerged, squat heavy with a strange, almost insect-like suspension. It didn't look like any Sherman or Pershing he had seen before. The lines were sharper, the armor thicker. But what caught his eye most were the treads, massive, reinforced with deep cleats, moving with an almost animal smoothness. It wasn't a typical tank crawl. It was fluid, deliberate, like something alive. The general chuckled again. "They built a tractor," he said dryly. "A very ugly tractor." What he didn't know, what no one in the German command truly understood at that moment, was that the machine in front of them represented years of desperation, innovation, and quiet obsession, born out of battlefield nightmares in North Africa, refined to the frozen hell of the Ardennes, and perfected in secret testing fields far from the front. This tank wasn't designed to look pretty. It was designed to do the impossible, to take terrain out of the equation. The story begins years earlier, not in a factory or a battlefield, but in a muddy ditch in Tunisia. American tank crews had learned the hard way that terrain could be as deadly as enemy fire. Sand dunes, ditches, rubble. Tanks that couldn't maneuver were sitting ducks for German 88s. Engineers back home began to ask a simple question. What if a tank could climb? Not just roll over, but truly climb. Obstacles, inclines, walls, anything that stood between it and the target. That question turned into a challenge, one that no traditional tank design could meet. Engineers at the Aberdeen Proving Ground started experimenting with radical suspension systems, hydraulic boosts, and track designs that defied convention. They drew inspiration from tractors, bulldozers, even mountain goats. What they built was ugly, heavy, and entirely impractical for mass production. But it could do something no other tank on Earth could. It could scale a sheer vertical face. By 1944, this experimental design had evolved into something the military dubbed the wall climber. Officially, it was a T-27 experimental assault vehicle, but the crews who drove it gave it another name, the Spider, because when it moved, its suspension legs extended and compressed like limbs. It didn't just move forward, it crawled. And that crawling motion gave it the ability to climb almost anything that would stop a normal tank cold. When the Allies advanced deeper into Europe, they encountered fortified towns, stone walls, and anti-tank traps that made traditional armor useless. The T-27 was brought out of testing for one mission, to see if it could breach those defenses. The men who operated it had been handpicked. Engineers, mechanics, daredevils. They were told almost nothing about what they were getting into, just that their tank wasn't ordinary, and their mission wouldn't be either. The first demonstration took place before senior Allied and captured German officers, a psychological weapon as much as a military test. Intelligence officers knew the Germans had dismissed American tanks as crude and underpowered. They wanted to show them something that would break that belief. And so, under the bright morning sun, the T-27 rolled into the field. The German general watching that morning was no fool. He commanded armored divisions across Russia, seen every variant of tank the Allies had to offer. To him, the wall climber was a gimmick, an engineer's fantasy. He had seen promises of wonder weapons before, machines that were supposed to change the war, and most of them had ended up as scrap. That's why he was laughing. Not out of arrogance, but because he thought he'd seen it all. But as the tank approached the concrete barrier, a solid wall, 2 meters high, something shifted in his expression. The engine tone changed, deepened, as the driver adjusted gears. The front treads gripped the wall, pressed against it, and instead of stopping, the tank began to rise. Slowly, steadily, impossibly, the massive machine pulled itself upward, its rear tracks grinding for purchase until the entire body was vertical. Then, with a mechanical groan, it climbed over the top and came down on the other side. still firing. The general's cigarette dropped from his lips. That moment would become the legend. But to understand how it happened, you have to go back to the young engineer who refused to listen when everyone told him it couldn't be done. His name was Robert Kessler. He wasn't a soldier or a commander, but a civilian mechanical engineer drafted into the Army's experimental division. Kessler had spent his pre-war career designing heavy construction vehicles, things that could scale loose gravel slopes and pull themselves out of quarries. He was fascinated by balanced traction and torque distribution. When he joined the Army, he was put to work fixing the endless problems with tank suspensions that snapped or jammed under combat stress. But he had other ideas. He believed that tanks didn't need more armor or firepower. They needed more mobility. His obsession grew when reports from North Africa came in. American tanks bogged down in dunes, immobilized in wadis, picked off by German artillery. To him, it wasn't bravery or numbers that would win battles. It was the ability to move where the enemy thought you couldn't. He began sketching designs late at night. Multi-jointed suspensions, variable track angles, tanks that could flex their hulls, even step over obstacles. When his commanding officer saw the drawings, he called them science fiction. But Kessler wouldn't stop. Eventually, he convinced a handful of mechanics to help him build a small-scale prototype using spare Sherman parts. It didn't look like much, more like a construction rig than a tank. But when they tested it against a 4-foot wall, it crawled right over. That moment, he said later, was when the tank stopped being a machine and started being a creature. By 1943, word of his experiments reached higher command. The Army didn't fully believe in the concept, but they saw potential for special missions, urban sieges, mountainous terrain, or beach assaults. And so, in secret, they greenlit a limited prototype, the T-27. As the T-27 thundered down the far side of the wall, its treads landing with a bone-shaking crash, the air around the test field erupted with a mix of disbelief and adrenaline. Dust clouds swallowed the tank, and for a few seconds it disappeared completely, until the deep growl of its engine broke through again. Then came the sound that silenced everyone. The steady rhythm of its 76 millimeters cannon firing, one shell after another, each impact sending plumes of smoke into the horizon. The German general didn't laugh anymore. His face had turned to stone. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath. The American officers around him said nothing. They were just as stunned. The tank hadn't just climbed the wall. It had kept fighting while doing it. The impossible machine had proved itself in front of both allies and enemies alike. The test was over in less than 10 minutes. But those 10 minutes would be talked about for decades among the few who had witnessed it. The engineers watching from the control tower stood speechless. Robert Kessler, the man whose sketches had once been mocked, simply stared through the binoculars, his hands trembling. He wasn't watching a machine anymore. He was watching his idea come to life. After the demonstration, the T-27 was rolled back to the hangar for inspection. Its hull was covered in dust, its suspension steaming from the strain, but it was intact. Not a single track link had snapped, not a single weld had fractured. For a prototype built under extreme secrecy and limited resources, that was nothing short of miraculous. Yet the Army, ever cautious, wasn't ready to celebrate. They saw potential, but they also saw complexity. The tank required maintenance every few hours. Its hydraulics overheated quickly, and its movement system was far too costly to replicate. In a war where quantity mattered more than elegance, a single miracle tank wasn't enough. Still, Kessler and his small team were given permission for limited field trials. The first real combat test came in the spring of 1945, in the collapsing chaos of Western Germany. The Allies were encountering towns turned into fortresses, walls reinforced with concrete, streets choked with rubble. Normal tanks couldn't get through without taking devastating losses. The T-27 was transported secretly under canvas to the outskirts of a ruined village near the Rhine. The objective was simple: see if it could breach a German defensive position that had already held off 2 Allied assaults. The crew, 5 men who had trained with Kessler himself, knew this was no ordinary mission. They nicknamed their tank Old Spider, painting a small red emblem on the side of the turret. As dawn broke, Old Spider crept forward. The German soldiers entrenched in the village had no idea what was coming. They heard the familiar rumble of engines and prepared their anti-tank guns. The first shells hit the wall of the village, shattering stone and kicking up debris. When the T-27 came into view, its silhouette was unfamiliar. Lower, bulkier, crawling rather than rolling. The first German shot hit its front armor. The shell ricocheted harmlessly. Then, to their horror, the tank began to climb. The villagers later described it as a steel beast walking on the wall. The treads gripped, the hydraulics hissed, and within seconds the tank was above the defensive line, its gun rotating downward. The next moment, the 76mm cannon roared, blasting the German machine gun nests from directly above. Soldiers scattered, abandoning their positions in disbelief. No one had ever seen a tank do that before, not even the Germans with all their advanced engineering. The Allied infantry moved in behind it, cheering as the tank cleared a path where no path had existed. For them, the T-27 wasn't just a weapon, it was a miracle of mobility. After the battle, a war correspondent wrote a short, classified report calling it the tank that climbs walls. The name stuck, though the story itself never made it to the newspapers. Officially, the Army denied that such a vehicle existed. But among the soldiers who had seen it, the legend began to grow. Rumors spread across units. Stories of a secret American tank that could climb buildings, drive up cliffs, even crawl across trenches without slowing down. Each retelling made it sound more supernatural. Some said it could rotate its turret while vertical. Others swore it fired rockets. And somewhere in a German camp, the general who had once laughed was now giving warnings to his staff. If the Americans can build that thing in numbers, he said, then our walls mean nothing. The truth, of course, was more complicated. The T-27 was real, but deeply flawed. It required constant calibration, and its suspension system was delicate. Kessler's design was brilliant, but far ahead of its time. Hydraulics in the 1940s simply couldn't handle prolonged battlefield abuse. After every test, engineers had to replace entire sections of the track system just to keep it running. But the Army saw something more valuable than the machine itself. They saw the idea, a new philosophy of armor warfare. Tanks had always been about brute force, but Kessler's design proved that agility could be just as powerful a weapon. It was a spiritual ancestor of every adaptive suspension and off-road combat vehicle that came after. Meanwhile, in post-war Europe, captured German engineers began asking questions. They had seen the same thing, a tank that seemed to defy physics. Some thought it was propaganda. Others believed it was an Allied copy of an abandoned Nazi concept. In truth, Germany had once planned a Kletterpanzer, or climbing tank, during the early years of the war, but it never left the drawing board. The idea was dismissed as too impractical. And yet, here it was, built by the very enemy they'd underestimated. When Kessler returned home after the war, he didn't receive medals or headlines. His project remained buried in classified archives, overshadowed by the mass-produced Shermans and Pershings that had won the war. But in a few engineering circles, whispers about the Spider tank persisted. In one declassified memo from 1946, an Army colonel wrote, "The T-27 is not a weapon of war. It is a weapon of terrain. Where roads end, it begins." Years later, when American designers began working on advanced suspension systems for Cold War tanks, some of them cited Kessler's forgotten patents. His concepts, track flexion, hydraulic stabilization, variable ground pressure, became the backbone of future vehicles like the M60 and the experimental XM551 Sheridan. His influence survived even when his name did not. But for the soldiers who saw it in action, the memory remained vivid. One of the crewmen, years later, told an interviewer, "When we climbed that wall, it felt like we broke the... No transport logs, no wreckage, no serial records. Just gone. Some say it broke down and was scrapped quietly. Others claim it was taken by a post-war research team, hidden deep in a classified hangar somewhere in the American Midwest. And a few, the ones who really believe in military ghosts, insist that decades later, somewhere in a desert test range, engineers heard the sound of an old engine starting up, the unmistakable growl of a tank that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The hangar doors groaned as they swung open, and there it was, the T-27, Old Spider, sitting in silence under a dim light, dust coating its armor like an old memory. The war was over. The engineers who had built it were being reassigned or retiring. Its mission was done, its legend sealed. Yet for Robert Kessler, standing there one last time in front of his creation, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a warning that someday soldiers would need to climb again. Weeks after the Rhine operation, the T-27 had been ordered back to the proving grounds for evaluation and disassembly. But when the transport crew arrived, it was gone. The paperwork was missing. The storage log was blank. For decades, no one could explain how a 30-ton experimental vehicle simply vanished from a secure military facility. Officially, it was written off as decommissioned and scrapped. But unofficially, whispers began spreading among mechanics and test pilots, rumors of a ghost tank stored in a hidden desert hangar used for classified mobility research. No photos were ever released. No documents ever surfaced. Just second-hand accounts and strange sightings in the late 1950s. Engineers claiming to have seen a bizarre tracked vehicle moving silently across steep cliffs at night, climbing where no tank should. But that mystery, the disappearance, was only half the story, because the legacy of the T-27 lived on in the minds of those who saw it work. When the Cold War began, the U.S. military faced a new challenge: building machines that could survive not just open battlefields, but mountains, jungles, and nuclear ruins. A tank that could adapt to any terrain suddenly didn't sound like science fiction anymore. Old design files from Kessler's archive were quietly pulled from storage, re-examined, and repurposed. Some of the concepts, hydraulic articulation, load balancing, terrain mapping, reappeared years later in the designs of the M728 combat engineer vehicle, and even in NASA's early rover research. Kessler himself, however, faded into obscurity. He retired quietly to a small town in Michigan, never giving interviews, never boasting about what he built. When asked once about the wall climber, he simply smiled and said, "It was never about the wall. It was about proving that walls don't matter." But the story wasn't over. In 1978, a team of defense contractors working at the Yuma Proving Grounds reported discovering unusual track impressions during a test of a new desert mobility vehicle. The tracks didn't match any known pattern. They were deep claw-like and, most strangely, perfectly spaced for a vehicle roughly the size of a World War II-era medium tank. The sand was compacted so hard that report, captured in Allied archives, had a single handwritten note in the margin. It read, "If this is true, then the next war will not be fought behind walls. It will come over them." It was signed by General Erich Muller, Panzer Corps Command. After the war, Muller became an advisor in West Germany's rearmament program. Some of his own designs for post-war armored recovery vehicles bore striking similarities to Kessler's suspension system. Coincidence? Maybe. But the influence of that one demonstration had spread much further than anyone realized. Decades later, modern tanks would adopt advanced track flexion, automatic balance stabilization, and obstacle scaling capabilities, all rooted in the same dream: unrestricted mobility. Machines like the Swedish Stridsvagn 103, with its unique hull aiming system, and the American M1 Abrams, with its torsion bar suspension and agility, all trace back in spirit to that one moment in 1944 when a tank climbed a wall and kept firing. But perhaps the most fascinating part came in 2003, when a historian researching declassified engineering projects stumbled across a half-burned set of blueprints in the National Archives. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the title was still visible: T-27 Revision 3, Terrain Adaptive Armor Platform. And at the bottom, in small letters, a signature: R. Kessler. The design included something remarkable, not just climbing hydraulics, but an early concept of a terrain sensor array. It used primitive analog sensors to measure ground resistance and automatically adjust suspension height, the exact same principle later used in modern off-road vehicles and even Mars rovers. In other words, Kessler had not only invented a climbing tank, he had designed a thinking one. It's easy to dismiss such stories as wartime myths, exaggerated tales of impossible machines. But the evidence, scattered, partial, haunting, tells another story, a story of how human ingenuity, born out of desperation, can blur the line between the possible and the unbelievable. Imagine standing on that test field in 1944, the dust choking the air, the smell of oil and ozone, a German general standing stone-faced, a group of Allied officers holding their breath, and then that sound, the low growl of an engine refusing to stop, the sight of steel treads clawing against concrete, a machine breaking every rule of warfare right before their eyes. It wasn't just a tank that climbed a wall. It was a moment that changed how humans thought about machines, about mobility, about overcoming limits. The T-27 didn't win the war, but it reminded those who built that wars aren't only fought with weapons, they're won with ideas. And that's the true legacy of Robert Kessler's creation, not the mystery of where it went, not the speculation about secret hangars or ghostly engines in the desert, but the lesson it left behind, that every wall, no matter how high, how strong, how impossible, can be climbed. Years later, when Kessler passed away, his daughter found a notebook among his belongings. On the first page was a simple drawing, a rough sketch of a tank halfway up a wall, its gun pointing skyward. Beneath it, in his own handwriting, were 5 words. Let them laugh, then climb. And maybe that's the ending he wanted all along. Because somewhere in the echo of history, in the grind of treads, the hiss of hydraulics, and the roar of a cannon, the laughter of that German general still fades into silence, replaced by the sound of steel against stone, and a tank that refused to stop,